Hi, everyone. Welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. It's a fandom loving edition, a fan culture edition, and glad to be talking with a writer who has worked in a variety of worlds and across a variety of spaces, and that is Arie Kaplan. Arie, thank you for joining.
Hi, thanks, Jason. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, we were just bonding over love of Star Wars and our favorite Star Wars films, and the conversation has already taken us to probably three or four different licensed worlds just to talk through. Do you want to give a shout out to the shirt that you're wearing?
Yeah, this is a Flash hoodie that my wife got me, and but you can't really see it because it's just the Flash logos on the back. But I just thought the colors really pop, and I've been writing these short stories for this company called Chapter One, formerly known as Innovations for Learning, and they're like short stories for kids,
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
it's all to teach kids about things like diversity and inclusion and various issues, like various humanitarian crises that are going on in the world. And so I write short stories about all that stuff and teach kids about different cultures and stuff. And for those, I make these behind the scenes videos explaining what inspired me to write each story.
Love it, love it.
And I found that like when you wear colors that pop, it really helps the videos look good. So
Yeah,
because they can be
yeah,
really visually static otherwise, you know.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Probably the dark blue t-shirt was not the best choice, but that's okay. Hopefully
That's
people will
quite all
look
right.
over
No,
there.
no, but it's you look fine. Obviously, you don't need me to tell you that. But it's like, but I just made a choice recently where it's something like, how colorful could I be? How about like these glasses which are Play-Doh blue? They're like they look like they're made of clay or something like that. Anyway,
Perfect,
um,
perfect.
but yeah,
Yeah. So I'll mention a couple of worlds that you've worked in, but
sure.
I am also going to miss several because there's been a lot. Speed Racer, Star Wars Adventures. We were just talking about Star Wars a little while ago.
Mhm.
Batman, Jurassic Park, several books in the Golden Books lineup of texts that are so great for young readers. You've also written about things like SNL, Mad Magazine, as well as some anthology work with, I believe, a Robert E. Howard anthology as well.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
No, that's absolutely true.
and I missed like 22 things, I'm sure, but
That's
we can touch
that's
on some of those.
that's quite all right. But yeah,
Yeah,
you hit a lot of stuff that's near and dear to my, it's sort of like children, you can't, if you ask a parent what their favorite child is, they're not going to be able to tell you that, hopefully.
hmm
Hopefully they
hmm
don't have a favorite. And it's sort of like that with me as a writer. It's like it's hard to choose which one of these is my favorite because I've just had a lot of fun writing for all these different like iconic IPs.
Yeah. What took you to the written word? That's the English teacher question that I love to ask.
Sure, and it's a good one. And I don't know. I can think of like a couple of like I've been thinking about that ever since because I know that you asked because viewers slash listeners, here's some behind the scenes. Jason sent me some of these questions just to ruminate on them and everything and just think about them beforehand, which was a really good thing because it made me think about some very specific things that we would be talking about during this interview. And I that is definitely one of them. I can think of a couple of sort of formative moments when I was growing up where I thought, huh, I guess I'm good at this writing thing.
Hmm hmm
Like one of them was, and I I was 7 or 8 years old, so it's like se second or third grade, and we had to write this assignment. I should explain by saying that I went to this parochial school growing up, this school in Baltimore, Maryland, that was called Beth Day School. And so it was a parochial day school, Jewish day school. And so we were learning about the story of Jacob and Esau. And we had to write like an essay about them. And my essay was comparing some of the characters to He-Man and Masters of the Universe characters.
Love it. Yeah.
And like, the teacher, far from being like upset about that I was bringing like these silly pop culture characters into the equation, she was actually really impressed with like how descriptive the essay was, and also how funny it was. And I noticed it was making the other kids laugh, and which was what I was going for. And I was like, oh, maybe I'm good at this, I
hmm
guess, And
hmm
so there were a lot of moments like that, to the point that when I started attending college, when because I went to NYU and studied playwriting and screenwriting there. And you're surrounded when you're going to school in Greenwich Village in New York City. You're surrounded by like all these stand-up comedians who write their own jokes.
Hmm.
Hopefully, most of them do. Um, and all these like there were a lot of one-person shows, people like writing and performing their own material, getting up on stage and performing it. It's really exciting, and I noticed that there was like a lot of people doing that, and I noticed I had a lot of respect for like performers who wrote their own stuff, and that just the writing of it was really exciting to me. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but just
Hmm.
like the
Absolutely.
idea that you can create like, Stephen Sondheim has like a song in Sunday in the Park with George about creation. It's called Finishing the Hat.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it's like, and it one of the lines is like, look, I made a hat where there never was a hat. And it's the idea that just there was nothing there. There's a blank canvas or a blank page or a blank notebook, a blank screen, whatever you want to, depending on what kind of art, what kind of writing you're doing. Um, and you just made something out of nothing, and that something is actually works as a storytelling mechanism, as a vehicle for storytelling. Like just I find fascinating, because there
Hmm.
was literally nothing there, you know.
Yeah.
And so that's something that early on, and just the fact that you could, as a writer, come up with characters that the audience will fall in love with, and that's your goal,
Hmm.
um, is just like endlessly entertaining to me as a writer, and something I love to do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I love the story of a teacher that kind of gives you the space to say, "Hey, what are you good at? Share this with us," and that celebrates creativity instead of shutting it down. And then the other thing, among the things that I love about what you just said, is this idea that you're creating something out of nothing, and then what normally happens, or what often happens, is that you create something and then someone else goes, "Oh my gosh, that's so great. I need to create that too," or "I need to create something
Yes.
like that." Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll tell you something else, that there were a couple specific moments just as like a comic book fan when I was a kid that really, really resonate, which is that um and that I keep coming back to, which is that like when I was a kid, there was a comic book series that DC put out called Amazing Man.
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm gonna butcher these folks' names because I've never said the names out loud, and I've only seen them in print, and I've never heard them say out loud. But do you know Amazing Man? It's apostrophe Amazing, Mazing.
It sounds familiar. It does sound familiar.
It was, I think this is how this guy's name is pronounced, Bob Rozakis, who was
Yes. Hmm.
writing a lot of stuff for DC in the 80s. He was the writer and co-creator, and then Stephen DeStefano. Again, I hope that's how you say his name. If not Stephen, I apologize. Um, but Stephen DeStefano largely works in animation these days and is an incredible artist. And so those two guys created that series together. And it's about this sort of self-proclaimed superhero um, who lives in Queens, which is where I live now. And he kind of stops kids from getting run over and stops like rescues cats from trees and things like does like these
Hmm.
little acts of kindness. He's very altruistic, and it's about him and his friends, and it's sort of like a sitcom, but it's a comic book. It's about like him and his quirky friends, and one of his friends is named Denton Fix, and he has a dog's head but a human body, and he's a comic book writer, and so it's a comic book about a comic book writer and his best friend who's like a his self-styled vigilante, um, and I found it fascinating, and you could one of the things that I found fascinating about it, it only lasted a year. There were like 12 issues or something. And then they did specials for a while in like the late 80s and early 90s. And then that's it. That's all the world would see of Amazing Man. But it was very
Hmm.
critically acclaimed, but didn't last very long because I guess they weren't selling enough copies. Um, but it was written so much differently than like anything else that was being put out by DC at the time.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
not to badmouth the other stuff that they were putting out, but it was just written very differently, and you could tell. and just stuff like that. Like there were just storytelling choices people were making in comics that really got me on a gut level. Like I was reading Crisis on Infinite Earths, which I was fascinated
Mm,
by because it was in the early days of these company-wide crossovers. It was like Crisis at DC and Secret Wars at Marvel. And that
hmm.
was like the beginning of doing that, the beginning of doing these big events where everyone in the shared universe would get together to combat some big bad or whatever. And there was a moment where like Hawk and Dove were in the story a little bit,
Hmm.
and Dove
Hmm.
dies. He's like murdered by a shadow demon, by one of the anti-monitors. I think they're called shadow demons. If not, I'm calling them shadow demons, but they're sort
Perfect.
of shadow creatures. And I was like 10 or 11, and I had just like started to cry, even though I didn't know who Dove was. I had never heard of these Steve Ditko characters before, because DC had, I trying to think, they no, they weren't Charlton characters, but they were just characters I wasn't familiar with.
Hmm.
I was
Hmm.
trying to think if they were the part of the Charlton library of characters that DC had at that time recently acquired, but I don't think that's the case. Um, but I wasn't familiar with the characters, but I found myself getting emotional about these characters
Yeah. Yeah.
because Marv Wolfman and George Perez are such great writers and storytellers,
Mm,
and George Perez was such an incredible artist, and uh, they worked like this alchemy together, you know, working on Crisis. They pulled off this thing that they should not have been able to pull off because it should have collapsed under the weight of all the characters and all the world building, but it somehow works, you know?
hmm. Hmm.
And so they're just like these moments like that that I remember as a kid that really excited me and got me excited about comic book storytelling, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I connect with that a lot. And um, what are the moments as a writer yourself as you're creating that you kind of find that flow and excitement, kind of leading toward those ideas of some of the most positive experiences that have bubbled up over the years?
Well, a few things. I When I'm pitching ideas, I've learned over the years that you just have to go with your gut instinct.
Hmm.
You just have to. You just like there's a little voice in your head that's like, yeah, that's it. You're on the right track. Go with that. And you have to listen to that voice. And other times I haven't been successful is the time I haven't listened to that voice. And so like specifically, like this is the very beginning of my comic book writing career, unless you count Mad Magazine, a comic book, in which case I had been writing comics for 7 years at that point. But
Hmm.
I was a writer for Mad Magazine for a long time. Mad is technically a magazine, but it's also got a lot of comics in it. It's semantics. It's who
Yes,
cares? You know what I mean?
it's a book.
It's it's a book. But what's funny is that I wasn't in any of those comic book databases on the internet until after I started writing other comics like
Mm,
Speed Racer and Bart Simpson comics, and then they like grandfathered in all my Mad Magazine stuff. Um, and then I started appearing in like these comic book databases. So I don't know, whatever. But like I had just started writing non-Mad comics when I was writing Speed Racer. I had like written some Ben 10 comics for DC.
hmm.
And around that time, I think it was like the same week as I as the same week as my first two Ben 10 comic book stories had gotten bought by DC. I a couple of the pitches that I sent the editor were greenlit. And that same week I went to San Diego Comic-Con and I had a meeting with Chris Ryall at IDW, who was, I think, at the time the editor in chief. I think he was
Hmm.
certainly the
Hmm.
editor of this Speed Racer comic. Um, and I'd gone there because I had come close to selling the screenplay that was a vampire comedy and it was like a horror comedy. And I was like, oh well, IDW does a lot of vampire comics. At the time they did 30 Days of Night. And at the time they did the Angel and Spike comics from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And I was like, oh, I'll go there. I'll try to get a meeting with one of the editors. Maybe I can turn this screenplay into a graphic novel. Not the worst idea in the world.
Hmm.
I think they'd be a good buyer for that. And Chris is like, well, we're not really looking for very many original graphic novels right now. We're certainly not looking for vampire stuff right now, but I do see, I think I don't know if I'd shown him a resume or if I just told him, but he was like, you told me that you're writing some Ben 10 comics for DC. Those are kids comics. Those are all ages comics. We're looking for someone to write this all ages Speed Racer miniseries. Are you interested in pitching for that? And I was like, oh, absolutely. He's like, okay, so here's what we'll do. We'll set up a meeting, like a phone chat for like 2 weeks after Comic-Con is over so that we all have a chance to decompress.
Hmm.
And you'll like pitch me some ideas you've come up with over the phone. So I came up with like 10 story ideas for what the miniseries would be about. Because I was like, I'm sure there's other people who want this gig. I got to take it very seriously. And the 10th idea on the list, the last one that I was sure they would not be interested in because it was so silly, um, was this thing called Speed Racer Chronicles of the Racer, where Speed discovers that he's the last in a long line of champions that have been around since the dawn of human civilization. And so the story would uh, alternate back and forth between stories of the present day speed racer and the stories of his various ancestors. So, like in the ancient Roman Empire, there'd be a charioteer called Swiftus Romulus who had like a pimped out chariot that's like the Mach 5. It's called the Marcus V, the Marcus 5.
Hmm.
And it's very silly and it's very self-aware and it's very comedic in tone, but it's a kids' comic, so you're allowed to do that. I mean, I think you should do that for adult comics too. I have this theory that pertains to superhero comics, which is that there's not a single superhero character in any of these, in Marvel and DC, and any of these shared universes, that can't be improved 100% by turning it into a comedy.
Hmm. Hmm.
I stand by that completely. Exhibit A, the Batman TV series of the 60s. Exhibit B, the Lego Batman movie.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
Exhibit C, Teen Titans Go.
Yeah.
Um, Exhibit D, Thundercats Roar. I know some of these TV shows, some people in the fandom have a don't like them. You're wrong. You're wrong. Their Thundercats done as a comedy is so much better than Thundercats played straight. I'm so sorry. And I'm someone who grew up with Thundercats played straight as a TV show
Uh-huh.
and loved it. And I do love it. And I'm probably going to buy the Thundercats comic that comes out next month. Um, that I know Drew Moss, who's illustrating it. He
Hmm.
illustrated the Star Wars Adventures story I wrote in 2019. He's an incredible artist, but I'm sorry, these characters work better as comedies. I hate to tell you. But okay. So the last idea on that list of pitches was like Speed Racer Chronicles of the Racer, which is kind of a sci-fi comedy. It's the last on the list because it's so silly and it's so out there and it's so unusual. But this like voice in my head was like, you should pitch that first.
Hmm.
Because if you don't pitch it first, you might never get to it because Chris might like the one of the other ideas first. But my voice in the head was like, you and I both know that the best idea is Speed Racer Chronicles of the Racer. Pitch that first. So that's what I did. And as soon as I pitched it, he was like, I don't want to hear any of your other pitches. That's the one I like. I'm going to take it to Speed Racer Enterprises, which was the company that owned the rights to the IP at the time, and see what they think. And, they'll probably take like a couple weeks to get back to me. So you have to be a little patient. I was like, okay, that's fine. I'm used to that. I'd
Hmm.
been working in TV for a while, and you certainly sometimes need to wait a while to hear back on whether you've gotten the green light for certain story ideas or whatever. But what happened was he came back 2 days later and was like, that's the fastest green light I have ever gotten for anything. They loved it. Congratulations, you're writing the Speed Racer miniseries. We're going to do
Love it.
Chronicles of the
Love it.
Racer. And so that's what I'm saying as far as like this listening to your gut instinct. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? Um, and so I hope that answers the question. I know that like
Yeah.
deviated on like a bunch of different. Does that answer the
Yeah,
question?
yeah, and in a really interesting way too.
Okay.
What currently has your creative attention? What are you currently kind of processing and digging into
In terms of, as a fan or as a writer?
as a writer?
Oh, a couple of things. I've been writing a number of Lilo and Stitch children's books and Spider-Man children's books for Scholastic, and I'm having a lot of fun with those. Here, I can show you a couple of these right here. Um, and it's funny because Lilo and Stitch is, a sci-fi comedy. The movie is, and the various movies are, and the various TV shows are. Um, and so I wrote this, which is The Adventures of You and Stitch, which came
Hmm.
out
Hmm.
in September in time for the 2023 to 2024 school year. Um, and so it's this book where you go on all these adventures um, with Stitch, and each adventure is like an activity or something that you do to there's a certain goal in mind with it.
Hmm.
And I had so much fun writing it, but also tried to take it very seriously in terms of like what are some how can I make this the most fun book for a kid to take on like a long trip or vacation with their parents? So I tried whenever it was like a code that you had to decode. First of all, doing stuff like that helps keep it in universe because you're like, oh, the Galactic Federation needs you to decode this message so that you and Stitch can help like defeat these space pirates or whatever. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you get to like play in this world in this like sci-fi universe and still have it keep it immersive because you're able to like with codes and ciphers and stuff like that you're able to like still keep the illusion that you're doing these activities as part of the sci-fi universe. You know what I mean? Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Hmm.
um but also it's fun because you get to like think, okay, what haven't I seen in these kinds of books before? You go into like old codes from like World War One or World War or the Civil War or the time of Elizabethan England. You find these old codes that people haven't used in forever and they're in the public domain. And so you adapt them to like Lilo and Stitch or just Stitch, really, although Lilo plays quite a big role in this book too. Um, and then, uh, on the Spider-Man front, there's also the Spider-Man
Hmm.
comic book. I
Hmm.
should say I wrote the activity sections in this book and not the comic book sections, which were written by I think Steve Fox. And they were reprinted from like some other the comics he did for another book, I believe. But I just want to bring to your attention to here it is. It's this Daily Bugle thing where it's sort of like a Mad Lib, but not a Mad Lib because Mad Libs is owned by another company. But just basically the idea is I'm just going to tell you the premise. J. Jonah Jameson needs you to complete this unfinished article on Spider-Man.
Hmm.
Just a heads up, though, JJJ won't accept a positive article about the web slinger. So the idea is that it's like an unfinished article that somehow you as a reporter for the Daily Bugle need to finish, but you can't say anything positive about Spider-Man. So those are the rules. So there's like words that are like blanked out, and you have to fill them in, but it's all this anti-Spider-Man propaganda you have to finish. So it's
Nice.
fun because it's like one of those like, you're constantly having to challenge yourself because you're thinking, what haven't I seen in this kind of a book before? Now, look,
Hmm.
it's possible someone's done this kind of activity before, but I hadn't seen it, and so at least to my knowledge, I'm being original. You know what I'm saying?
It sounds original to me, and it sounds fun too.
Thanks. And it's a
Yeah.
lot of fun. It's like because of the fact that these are such well-developed characters too, you can just jump in there and put your own stamp on it and everything. I don't need to think like, oh, I don't understand who Peter Parker or Miles Morales are as characters or Gwen Stacy. I totally understand who these characters are
Hmm.
because they're very well designed and well developed. And so all I need to do is just go in there and just like have these characters. You could to think about something like Spider-Man. And Spider-Man is kind of a comedy series anyway, because he's always quipping and he's always making jokes. And that's a big part of like both Peter and uh, just all the Spider characters. It's part of Miles, it's part of Gwen. Is the even though some of the things that happen to them are quite serious, they don't take it too seriously.
Hmm.
Um, and also that's like an escape valve for when things do get too tense in a Spider-Man story. Is they can sort of comment on it or make a joke about it, sort of cut the tension, um, which I think makes these characters very relatable.
Yeah.
And another
Again, the
project
power
I've
of
been working
comedy.
on. Sorry?
The power of comedy. There again.
It is. I do think it is the power of comedy. I mean, I think that like, look, I'm the grandchild of Holocaust survivors, and I think that I heard my mother and I. My mother, who's the child of Holocaust survivors, she and I saw Schindler's List together when I was growing up, because it's something that honestly, if you're a descendant of Holocaust survivors, you have to kind of see that movie at some point to understand what your ancestors went through. I certainly did understand, being that my maternal grandmother was alive for my whole childhood. You if you are educated as to what the Holocaust was, you know what those blue numbers on our arm mean. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
So, um, but so we went and saw Schindler's together. My point is, there are a couple of lighthearted moments in the first act of Schindler's List.
Mm-hmm.
There's a couple jokes here and there because Steven Spielberg and the writer, who's the writer who I can't remember what the screenwriter's name was. Um, but they understand that even with a story about the Holocaust, there need to be some moments where you need to have like lighthearted moments. Not that you're treating the Holocaust in an insincere way, or not that you're
Mm-hmm.
writing it off as though it's a comedy. You're not doing that. That would be disrespectful to all the people who died and to the, it would feel disingenuous. But people make jokes even in times of great stress. People,
Mm-hmm.
that's a part of our lives. You know what it just, does that make sense what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so
Absolutely.
it's not like you're mocking the Holocaust. But what you're doing is you're showing people and all the facets of these people, and you're showing all the different sides and all the different colors of who they are, which include the good times as well as the bad times. And you're showing that before the Holocaust happened, these were people who had lives, and they were fully functioning lives, and that they laughed as well as cried. And do you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's true of like all movies about very serious subject matter, that you have to show when things were good for them, so that you show when things fall apart. It's so devastating, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense. I'm
It,
not, I don't, this is the internet, so anything I say could be taken and completely warped and changed. And so I don't, I'm not saying
not
to
by
triv
me.
no, but I'm not saying that I'm trivializing the Holocaust. I take this stuff extremely seriously, especially as someone whose family members were murdered during the Holocaust. You know, but I'm saying that, like, even with a story which is very serious, you can't have 2 hours of just dead seriousness, because the audience will feel like they are losing oxygen. You know
Mm-hmm.
what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
You need to give them an escape from that at some point during the story, or
Yeah.
else they will just feel like they are drowning. Yeah. And I noticed you have Batman mug. It probably won't make it into this episode, but I have a very embarrassing experience that when I was 14, I tried to buy everything, all of my clothing items be Batman themed.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's not great for like ninth grade when you're trying to make an impression on people. Maybe made the wrong impression. Anyway,
Yeah.
let's get started.
It works. It works. The Bat Cave of ninth grade. Um, so you're talking about your grandmother, and I wanted to give you a chance to mention the work that kind of touches on some of those themes before maybe we'll talk Batman. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more Batman and Golden Books and things of that nature.
Sure, yeah, because I certainly have some like that. Having written a few Batman children's books and a Batman story for Mad Magazine, um, that was done in comic book form too.
Yeah.
I certainly have evolved some theories over time about Batman and about Superman as well. Um, but okay, so I haven't written anything that deals directly with my family's experience during the Holocaust. I might at some point. I certainly have ideas for books, for children's books, for graphic novels about that subject, and about specifically about my grandmother's experiences.
Hmm.
But I was writing a trio of graphic novels for Capstone, and they came out, I think, at the beginning of 2021. And yeah, because I worked on them like late 2019, early 2020. One of them was this book called Trevor the Very Best Giant, illustrated by Miguel Diaz. And, it's about this kid named Lucas Torres who's being bullied by some of the other kids in the neighborhood. And he makes friends with this giant named Trevor. And originally the story was very, very sad because these were two very lonely people dealing with trying to grapple with their isolation and loneliness and kind of how they didn't fit in with the rest of the world. Now they find each other and become friends. And Trevor becomes sort of a grandfather figure to Lucas.
Hmm.
Now that all survived into the final draft of the script, and it all survived into the version of the graphic novel that was published by Capstone. However, um, the one big note that they had for me at the outline stage was this is so sad. Like those
Right.
characters are crying a lot, and you maybe make it a little happier. And so I did. So now there's like scenes of them like playing video games together, and there was always a scene with them playing chess together, which I always thought was kind of nice, and that's certain that was always there. But a lot of the crying, I think it became too sad, and especially for a children's graphic novel. And it wasn't until after I finished working on it when I realized why I had instinctively gone the really sad route with it and why it was such a sad story to I just keep using the same word. For a writer, that's not good. My mental thesaurus should be flickering on at this point, but it's not.
It's all good. It's all good.
Why it was so glum. There's that
That's
better.
right.
There you go.
Podcast rules
Uh,
are different. It works. It's
yeah.
fine.
Oh, okay. Just as a writer, I'm so used to being like, oh God, I'm not switching up the word choices enough. But and that's because like Trevor, the big secret is that he's not Trevor, the very best giant. That's what he calls himself, I think, three times in the story. And then at some point, Lucas finds out, he realizes Trevor is not the very best giant, he's the last giant. And he's the last of his kind. And that's the big reveal. And I told that to my wife while I was developing the script, and she was like, "Oh, that is the saddest thing I've ever heard." So that I think that's why it became so, not happy.
Mhm.
So but there's a happier way of telling the story, which is what I eventually found. But what I realized only after I finished working on this is that Trevor being the last of his kind and being this elderly person who becomes this sort of mentor figure to Lucas is that it was very much inspired by my experiences growing up with my grandmother. And that she was very much like the last of her kind based on what she had endured during the Holocaust, where she literally saw her family members being murdered and tortured. Um, And so it was sort of a metaphor that I guess some part of my brain was kind of grappling with it. You know what I mean?
Mhm. Mhm.
And so it automatically thought, oh, he's the last giant in the world. That's that's really, really not great. That's really sad. So let's make the story that way. Um, and so I think I only at that point realized, oh, this is like a metaphor for my family's experiences during the Holocaust. And it's this sort of thing that your brain sometimes works on in the back of your head, like while you're much more consciously trying to develop a certain kind of a story. And that's happened on a few different occasions, but that's definitely a good example of that. The other thing that's very nerdy about this book is that if you read the book, you look at Trevor and you might think, he looks kind of familiar. And the reason he looks kind of familiar is I told the artist, this is in the art notes for the script. I took the art notes. I told the artist to draw him to look like Patrick Stewart.
Oh,
And so
nice.
I don't know if you can see here, but you very much did.
Yeah.
Draw him like Patrick Stewart. Not where Patrick Stewart would sue, but Patrick Stewart, if you're watching this, please don't sue me. I'm a freelance writer. I can't deal with a lawsuit right now. But
It has been revealed.
yes, but that was very much the inspiration for the look of the character of Trevor. And so I always heard him talking like Patrick Stewart in my head while I was writing it. And so that's, I guess, very geeky just because Patrick Stewart's known for very geeky roles and, Star Trek and the X-Men and Excalibur and things like that. So,
Yeah. Yeah. But great voice. Great voice. I
what a
mean,
great voice. Yes, absolutely.
yeah. So I held up the Batman mug, and I know that you've worked on books. You mentioned Mad's take on Batman, which I
Mhm.
loved the sort of Mad version of Batman and Batman '89 and some of those stories. And you've also included characters like Harley Quinn, Killer Croc in the Batman universe. So please say more.
Sure. Okay, so the first, I mean, I guess the first Batman anything that I worked on that was like officially recognized by DC was and that had the DC literally the DC logo on it was um the Lego DC Superheroes Visual Dictionary
Hmm.
wrote
Hmm.
which came out was it 2018 or 2019, one of those 2 years. And I co-wrote that, so I guess counts as half a book for me. Um and, it had the Lego Batman characters from the Lego Batman movie in it. Um, so it had like Polka Dot Man and various other characters. And um, around the same time, around like shortly after I wrote that, I worked on this story for Mad Magazine, which I was a writer for Mad for many years. And the story is called What if Batman was actually 80 what if Batman were actually 80 years old? So right here you can see part of it, and it's illustrated by the great Pete Woods, who, if you're listening to this or watching this, you might know him from his work on Deadpool. He wrote a lot of Deadpool comics for Marvel for a while, and he wrote one or two of the Superman titles is either Action Comics or Superman for DC for a while as well. And he's extremely talented. I didn't know he was this good at likenesses because he does some caricatures of some of the Batman actors in like the final panel of the story, and he just crushed it. He did an amazing job.
Yeah.
Um, but here's the weird thing about that. Okay, so it's Batman and the Joker playing as old men because
Hmm.
we put this out. This was published in 2019, which was Batman's 80th birthday, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so the whole premise is, what if Batman was really 80 years old? The story originally was going to be, what if Superman was really 80 years old? Because I pitched it to Mad in 2018. But then they were like, it's almost 2019. Can you write it as Batman? What if Batman was 80 years old and we could put it out in 2019? I was like, oh, that's a really good idea. I'd love that. And so I had two premises, two pitches for it. They were like, what's the plot? Because I basically pitched them a bunch of loose jokes because I thought that's what it would be. And one or two of them made it into the final product, which was like Joker making fun of Batman. He's like, I hope you don't get disoriented and wander into a Marvel comic, And so there were a couple of lines like that from the original version of it that made it in there, but mostly it's Batman and the Joker as crotchety old men playing chess in the park in the in a park that's very much like Washington Square Park because in New York City, because obviously Gotham City is really New York City, as we all know. Um, and I realized only after I wrote this, like something, whenever I hear someone talking about writing like the last Batman story, or that this is, Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns is the last Batman story. It's like it's the end of Batman's narrative. It's what's going to be the end of it, or that Batman: The Dark Knight Rises, the Christopher Nolan movie. That's the third Christopher Nolan movie, right? I think it is. Yeah, the Dark Knight Rises is the end of his Batman journey. That's the end of his trilogy of Batman movies. And I realized I was getting really annoyed at hearing people say that. Here's the reason. I thought my story, this is what an ego I have, apparently. I thought my story is the last Batman story. And that's actually, it's not because of my ego or anything. It's just because I thought, in my mind, that's what I want the last Batman story to be.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
realized that the reason for that is I I said something in the last in the first part of our interview
Hmm.
last week that I think I should probably clarify, which was that like every superhero character can only be improved by writing the adventures of that character as a comedy. And I think for the most part that's true. I think that look, I mean, obviously Batman is a very durable character. You can do him as a comedy. You can do a Batman story that's a comedy, and that's a
Hmm.
very broad slapstick comedy. You can do Batman story that's like an action comedy. It's mostly an action story with a few jokes here and there. You can do what Matt Reeves had did in his first Batman movie with Robert Pattinson, where it's very serious. And I love that movie, and I love the Christopher Nolan Batman movies as well. So
Hmm.
I want to just say that. But I think that with my worldview and my own personality, the way I see it, I can't imagine Batman and the Joker not achieving some kind of common ground,
Yeah.
understanding, and eventually becoming friends and eventually ending their lives by playing chess in the park together. That's where that, like, they end like Professor X and Magneto
Hmm.
playing chess in the park. You know what I mean? It's like, to me, that's where that narrative ends. And I can't, you're never going to convince me that there's any other way for them to end their story. And so to me, that's the end of their, because the Joker is so much like Batman in so many ways. And there have been a lot of comic book stories that have dealt with that. The fact that
Hmm.
in some ways they're very similar. Batman's not a, he's not a psychopath like the Joker is, but in some ways they're both shaped by trauma. If you believe in the Killing Joke as being, the canon origin story for the Joker. And they're both very theatrical and they're both, they have some things about them that they're very similar. In a way, Batman is the only person who truly understands the Joker, and in a way, vice versa. In a way, Joker is the only one who truly understands Batman. And so I thought like they would have this sort of like odd couple ending where they're playing chess together. And so to me, this is, if I was writing Batman, the comic book, this is not that different than the way I would end it. Even if I was writing it as a serious Batman story. And again, I'm not saying that all superhero comics need to be written as comedies, but I'd say a lot of them could benefit from it. And a
Hmm.
lot of these characters were designed in the 40s and 50s and 60s for 8 to 12-year olds. You know what I mean? And so
Hmm. Hmm.
that's the DNA of the character, and it lends itself to jokes and funny situations. That being said, obviously I enjoy like a serious Avengers comic, much like anyone else. But um, but this really is like the end of these characters' stories, and so like, to me anyway. And
Hmm.
I was
Hmm.
given an incredible amount of leeway, by the way. Like, all the little details in this story were in the script. Like the dinosaur in the Batcave has a long beard and like little reading glasses. That was in the
Oh.
script. And that the giant penny in the Batcave having a long beard as well, and mustache, as though it's gotten older with Batman. That was also in the script. The fact that he has like one of those little golf visors that he's wearing, it was they asked me to come up with ideas for that before I committed to the entire script.
Hmm.
And the first idea was Batman and Joker playing chess in the park, and it gets into them like insulting each other, and then a talent agent comes and offers to give them a stage play where they're insulting each other, and that's the play, and that's how it ends. That was the first idea. The second idea was Bane and Killer Croc start a fight club in an old age home, and 80-year-old Batman has to stop it. I'm sorry, I should say 80-year-old Bane and 80-year-old Killer Croc start a fight club at an old age home.
Right.
It works better if you understand that everyone involved is elderly. Um, which, and basically, Rebecca Bohannon, who was the editor, was very much like, I like both of these ideas. You choose which one you want to do. And I was like, oh, I guess the one with the chess in the park, but it's
Hmm.
hard to pick because they both sound like a lot of fun, right? You
Right.
know,
Right.
and I would have loved to have written 80-year-old Bane as well. But it's hard because, like I said, Batman's a very durable character. There's a lot of great Batman supporting characters out there. Now, when I was writing Batman children's stories, which I
Hmm.
did twice, unless of course you count the Lego Batman Visual Dictionary, which was also a children's book. But these I've written solo. Um, One of them was Batman Swamped by Croc, because you can't say Killer Croc in a children's book, so he's just Croc. And
Okay.
one of them is Harley at Bat, where Batman fights Harley Quinn, of course.
Hmm.
And the one thing I noticed about writing Batman for kids, I was like, there's something different about him, and I can't put my finger on it. Because, you're trying to get into a character and see the world through Batman's eyes while you're writing Batman stories, even if they're just children's book stories. I think that's very important to like just sort of get into the right headspace to write a Batman story, to sort of see things through Batman's point of view. And I was something about it was reading as different to me. And I was like, what is it? And then I realized what it was. The children's book version of Batman does not have dead parents.
Ah.
Now,
Hmm.
maybe I'm wrong about that. I've seen, I used to write short stories for Disney, for Marvel Press, which is an imprint of Disney Book Group. And they would be in these big anthology books like 5 Minute Avengers stories and 5 Minute Spider-Man stories. And so there were stories you could read to a kid in 5 minutes. So you had to
Hmm.
time them with a stopwatch while you're writing them.
Hmm.
And I did not write, Black Widow was in a couple of the stories I wrote, but I saw another writer write a Black Widow origin story for very young kids. And she managed to pull it off. She managed to like figure out how to make that work and make some of the darker aspects of the Black Widow origin story work in children's book form.
Hmm.
I don't know if there's been a children's book version of Batman where we've seen his origin story, at least for kids this young, because this is for very young children, you know?
Hmm. Hmm.
I don't know if there has been, and if there has, I don't know if they've dealt with Batman's parents getting murdered. But
Yeah.
in the way I see it, the difference is that the difference between Batman written for adults and Batman written for kids is that Batman written for kids does not have dead parents. Because once
Yeah.
you actually say that, once you say, oh, he doesn't have dead parents, that like sort of frees you up to do things that regular Batman would never do, but that this Batman would do. Do you see
Hmm.
what I'm
Hmm.
saying?
Hmm.
Because it suddenly makes the world a lot less gloomy,
Yeah.
the world of Batman. Because you're like, oh, yeah, okay, I can see him being a bit friendlier. I can see him being the stories being a bit more lighthearted. Because
Hmm.
somehow you don't have that big, like, albatross around his neck of the parents dying. Do you know what I'm
Right.
saying?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Not that that ruins the story by any standard. I think it gives adult-oriented Batman a much more gravitas and everything that he kind of needs in a lot of these
Hmm.
stories. Unless, of course, you're writing like Lego Batman. I mean, Lego Batman has dead parents too. Will Arnett sings that Darkness Dead Parents song, that Darkness Dead Parent,
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
song in the Lego Batman movie. And of course, they deal with that, but they deal with that in a very funny way.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no room to do that here because it would be seen to be mocking death.
Hmm.
Because even though these are written for kids, they're not comedies. And even if they were comedies, you would have to write it a very certain way. And I don't think parents would like a story that mocks death that they're reading to their kids. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. It raises a lot of questions at
It
story
raises a
time
lot of
for
questions.
sure.
Whereas
Yep.
with a movie that you're seeing with your kids, that's very self-mocking and self-referential, like the Lego Batman movie, and that's sort of as much for parents as it is for kids. You can do that. You can kind of square that circle. You can you can do something that's very irreverent
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
that it's understood that the kids will understand. And also, honestly, Lego Batman movies written for sort of older kids too.
Yeah.
So, a lot of the pop culture references and everything are for that. So, you know, but in this you kind of can't do that.
Yeah. There's references that sometimes aimed at the adults, sometimes aimed at the older kids. So definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and there's, by the way, one other thing about this, and I think I mentioned this in a blog post once, but I want to just get the word out about this as much as possible because it's so weird. There's like a phantom limb from an early draft of the script and that made it into this book, which is that in a couple pages you see a yacht,
Hmm.
but you don't see who the yacht belongs to. I mean, it's implied that it doesn't read as a phantom limb because it's implied that the yacht is just some crashed yacht that's fallen into disrepair, which is what it is. But in an earlier draft of the script, the yacht said like the SS Bruce Wayne or the SS Thomas and Martha Wayne or something like that. And so it
Ah.
was implied that it was Bruce Wayne's yacht that had crashed that Killer Croc had stolen and put in the swamp. And that
Ah. Gotcha.
Batman doesn't realize that until the end. And then he's like, hey, that's my yacht. And so that was going to be like a fun joke to sort of bring it all, uh, full circle. But he didn't say it out loud because he didn't want Croc to know that he was really Bruce Wayne. But he
Yeah.
was like, It was something, or I think he says something like, "And I'll get this yacht back to its rightful owner, Bruce Wayne," or something to that effect. But these are the things that happen when you go through like different drafts of the story.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I'm always telling my students about revision, so curious about that process of, I mean, how many sort of takes is common around a project like that?
It really depends. I try to get each draft as close to perfect as I can. The way I see it, the people who are hiring me to write these scripts are, I'm very grateful to them for doing that.
Mm,
And I want to make this story, I want to impress them and wow them so that they give me the next gig and that they keep hiring me, that they enjoy working with me. And so, I try to make these scripts as good as possible. That said, obviously, sometimes there's going to be revisions that are necessary. Now, are you asking about my process in writing these, or are you?
More or less, yeah. I'm just curious if there are ideas like that that sort of get chopped often and then you have to rework and sort of adapt to it in that way.
Sometimes, with the Harley Quinn book, with Harley at Bat, there was a couple of okay, Batman's fighting Harley Quinn inside a sports stadium, and so they're fighting. There's even a name for it. Yeah, okay. It's Gotham City Stadium. That's what it's. I thought there was a more official term, but I think it's just Gotham City Stadium. And so she's stolen a diamond that's shaped like a baseball,
Hmm, hmm.
which was, I got to say, the whole thing wasn't my idea. My editor Dennis Shealy came up with like sort of the basic bones of the story. Like, well, we've got Batman and Harley Quinn, and they're fighting. And she's got a diamond shaped like a baseball, and she's using a baseball bat and whacking the ball around like she's hitting a baseball, and she's playing baseball with the Joker in the stadium, and Batman has to stop her. And you come up with the rest. You know what I mean?
Hmm,
And
hmm.
so it's sort of that. Uh, and there were a couple of discussions back in when we were going back and forth on the story when I was working on it about certain things. Are they appropriate or not? Like
Hmm.
I thought it would be really great because I don't think I'd seen it's possible that Harley Quinn's done this in the past because there have been so many Harley Quinn stories, especially when you add up the different animated shows with Harley Quinn and the movies, the live action movies, and the comic books and everything else, the video games. I don't know if Harley's ever used a t-shirt cannon as a weapon, but that's an early draft of the script had her like shooting t-shirts at Batman and knocking him over with them. And I thought they're just teeth or they're just t-shirts. It's harmless. It's not like she's shooting bullets at him.
Right.
But the note that I got, it was either from my editor or from DC Comics, I can't remember which, was, that's a little violent. Let's have it be something else. And that's totally fair. I was happy to change it. But that's like one of those notes that, you sort of like, you're always kind of walking that fine line when you're writing a children's story anyway. You're just sort of
Hmm.
thinking, is this appropriate? Is it inappropriate? You got to try and make your best decision. And then, if the people you're working with disagree, then you've got to change it. So
Right.
that's an example of that. Now my process is very different. And if you want me to go into that, I can. But if the
I was actually going to ask, so this
Yeah,
is
sure,
kind of a process question because
sure.
you work in video games, you work in television, animation, and you work in comics and
Yes.
kind of prose. So I'm curious about how the process changes and how you sort of maneuver from space to space that way.
Ah, well, that's a good question. Um, the process doesn't change as much as you'd think because over time I've like developed certain methods for writing, and they kind of apply to any kind of writing I'm doing.
Hmm,
I used
hmm.
to think that they didn't, and then I learned the hard way that they did because a lot of my process is about like getting in the right headspace to write any story and just sort of feeling like I am the characters and like the characters are as real to me as they can be, and their dialogue is as authentic as it can be and as much as the way a real person would talk as it could be, and the fight sequences and slapstick comedy sequences feel as kinetic and as organic to the story as they can be, etc. And so, and that the story is structured as well as it could be, and that I can turn a plot outline into a fully developed script or manuscript, depending on which medium I'm writing for, without too much hassle, and without rewriting the outline that much. And
Hmm.
so the process for that is that, um, and I was on Dollar Bin Bandits recently, and I like unfortunately gave like a little backwards explanation of this. So I'm sorry, Oren. I accidentally told this a little bit backwards, but this is what the process is for stuff like that. This applies again. This applies to video games. It applies to comic books. It applies to everything. Animation, live action TV. Is that often what I'll start with is what I call a story cauldron, and that's like a blank document, just a Word document. And I'll just write all of my ideas. Everything goes into the pot. Everything goes into the cauldron. Even the dumbest ideas, because something that you might think is a dumb idea might turn out to be a great idea,
Yeah,
and you were just
yeah.
being too hard on yourself. Or maybe it's a dumb idea that with some tweaking can be turned into a great idea. So everything goes in there. And then I start going into like these sort of like logic maps. Like okay, if Jason's doing this, Jason's hungry, and so he goes to the fridge, and all that's in the fridge is the dead body of the person he killed, and you know what I mean? And then oh God, I've got to call my friend who's a cleaner who will help me dispose of the body, and then that leads to this next scene where he's driving through town with the cleaner and the dead bodies in the trunk. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? And
Hmm.
then I'm like, oh, but that doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense because of this thing that's going to happen hasn't been set up earlier. So that's what I mean by your sort of logic mapping it. And then once you've got like a version of the outline that's working pretty well. What I like to do is I like to draw the whole thing out in storyboard, in like story sketches, in thumbnail sketches as much as possible.
Nice.
So yeah, so for a video game, that's yeah. I was just gonna say like I've written entire video game scripts like with all the branching dialogue and everything like that, where it's
Hmm.
like based on the story outline that I've written, and the story outline's been approved, and so I'm writing all the scenes, all the art notes, all the the stage directions, um, all the branching dialogue, all the multiple story paths. I'm drawing it all out in thumbnail sketches, like it's a comic book, like it's a storyboard. And then what that does a couple of things, because one of the things that it does is and it's also a really good method for writing comic books, I found. Because what it does is the fear that a lot of writers have, myself included, is like that blank page. It's like, oh
Hmm.
no, it's a blank page. I'm going to fill it up with stuff that sucks, and it's going to be a bad script because it's just off the top of my head. So what these different steps do is it breaks it down into chunks and it makes it more manageable. And also it's me saying to myself, see, no, you're not doing it based on nothing. You got the story cauldron to go
Hmm.
from
Hmm.
when you're doing the thumbnail sketches. And then the thumbnail sketches have temporary dialogue, like placeholder dialogue in there. So then when you're writing the real dialogue, you're having the thumbnail sketches to base it on. And then when you're writing the stage directions or scene descriptions, basically what the characters are doing, or art notes, whatever you want to call them, depending on which medium you're talking about, you're describing what you've drawn in the thumbnail sketches.
Hmm.
Do you know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Hmm.
If the drawing of Jason opening the fridge, you're like, Jason opens the fridge. That's the stage directions. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
basing it. So at no point are you basing it on nothing except in that initial story cauldron. And you've given yourself a free pass with that because basically you're saying the story cauldron is is all bets are off. Even the dumbest ideas, put everything in. So you're like letting yourself off the hook a little in that first step. Do you know? Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, yeah. I love that idea. I love that.
Thanks. So
Yeah.
it really helps it feel like, oh, you're developing the story, but you're doing it in a fun way. Because when you're drawing the thumbnail sketches, what that also does is it puts the story up on its feet for the first time ever, where you're
Hmm.
seeing these little actors, which is what the drawings are. These little actors are performing the story.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you're like, oh, okay. So that's how it would look if an actor performed it, if it's a TV script, or that's how it would look if the penciler drew it. Might not be as good as what the penciler would do, but the framing, the basic composition of the scenes, the basic composition of the page layout is more or less the same.
Hmm.
And you could be like, page one, panel two, it's a close up on Jason's face as he's turning around to see something behind him. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
it's because you've drawn it like that. So you're giving yourself ideas about framing, about shot composition, about all this stuff that's really important, and about what works best for the story. And because when you're turning the story cauldron into the thumbnail sketches, you're you're uh you're trimming a lot of fat because
Hmm.
your instincts are taking over at that point, your storytelling instincts, and you're like, oh, this is too much. This is too much plot to go on this page. I can't do that. I only have room for like 3 or 4 panels. I have to cut the scene with the woodchuck, and that has to go. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? There's
Hmm.
no room for that. And so you're being honest with yourself because you're drawing them as quickly as possible. You're not overthinking it, and you're not like ruminating on it.
Yeah.
You're like pretend that this has to be in tomorrow morning into the editor's inbox. You know what I
Hmm.
mean?
Hmm.
Like I'm just getting it out the door as quickly as I can, and almost like it's like you're doing improv comedy or something. Um, it's just very immediate, a lot of immediacy, as quick as I can, and then that's making you make snap decisions. And surprised how many of those snap decisions actually work. Now, some of them are bad because you haven't had much time to think about them, but some of them are good because you haven't had much time to think about them. So, you know what I'm saying?
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah,
And you can always
absolutely.
correct, and you can always correct later. It's not the first draft that the editor or the showrunner or whatever or the video game producer is going to see.
Nice,
You
nice.
know, it's just for you. So,
Cool. Very cool. Yeah. And I love that, as I mentioned, there's a lot to appreciate that attacking the terror of the blank page, for sure.
I mean, it's something we all deal with. It's something we all go through. It's like, how am I going to do this?
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, there's always a challenge to any writing assignment, and that challenge is, how am I going to do this?
Yeah, yeah.
But the answer is somehow, because I did it last time. Or if you're doing it for the first time, somehow, you know?
Yep, yeah. So I think that brings us to our final question, and that would be it's a two-part question.
Sure.
There are tiers to it, TIERS.
Oh,
Hopefully
yes.
not any
There,
other
there
kind.
might there might be this kind of tears as well, depending on how I answer. I
So
get really worked up.
oh, but that's fine. That's fine. It's a safe space. Um, so what is ahead in terms of creating that you can talk about? I know that some things are most likely in NDA territory and things like that, but anything you can mention. And then I always like to ask where people can find out more information about your work as well.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a couple things that came out very, very recently. Most recently, I wrote a couple of children's books for Scholastic that are out now that came
Mhm.
out literally earlier this month, and so that's pretty new. Um, Scratch and Sketch with Stitch, a
Love it.
Lilo and Stitch children's book. Thanks. And a Spidey and His Amazing Friends children's book called Search for the Missing Teddy Bear. And it's got a squishy Spidey head, so that's cute. That's fun. Um, and it's set in the world in the continuity of the Spidey and His Amazing Friends show on Disney Junior, which is
Mm,
also on Disney Plus.
mhm.
That was a lot of fun to write. And also I've been writing the 96 Facts series of middle grade celebrity biographies for Penguin Random House, and
Love it.
96 facts about 96 facts about Taylor Swift, and also 96 facts about whoops, now there it is. 96 Facts About Timothy Chalamet, which I'm getting. I
Nice.
thought I had closer to right beside me, and there it is.
This is the first time both
And
Taylor Swift and Timothy Chalamet have appeared on the show, so it's great to have both of them.
oh, good. Okay, yeah. Well,
Yes.
okay. I mean, both of them have worked on some fairly nerdy projects recently. I know Timothy Chalamet is about to be in the second Dune movie,
Yes,
and
looking
so
forward to that. Looking forward to
that
that.
that looks pretty incredible. Um, and and the Taylor Swift book's been doing extremely well. And I'm very proud of both of them, and I'm proud of the ones that I have cut that are coming up as well. There's like 96 Facts About Selena Gomez and 96 Facts About Lizzo, which are both coming out in March.
Nice.
Um, yeah, thanks. And then that also, I if you're interested at all in reading Trevor the Very Best Giant, that and two other graphic novels that I wrote for Capstone, The Troll Under Puzzlefoot Bridge and Frankie and the Dragon. Frankie and the Dragon, I talked about a lot last time I was, promoting a lot of my projects because Frankie Marble, the main character, is very, very much based on my daughter Avia, and it was sort of like a developing the story for this book was very much sort of a bonding experience for me and her when in the early days of the pandemic when I was working on it. So I have a special place in my heart for that book. And let's see. I don't. There was a second part to the question, and now I
It
don't
was
remember what it
spaces
is.
to go, the online spaces, things like that, where
Oh,
people can find out more.
oh, okay. Yeah. Well, there's my website, which is ariekaplan.com. I don't know if you're going to put it up
I
on
will.
here or anything.
I will.
Yeah, thank you. The homepage is my blog, so that's where I put blog posts, and I'm also like updating it and talking about upcoming projects, things like that. Um, and I hopefully will be able to announce a couple of things soon, because there's a couple new projects I'm working on that I can't say what they are yet, but I'm really excited about them, really proud, and they've in different media. During the pandemic, also, I worked on an episode of a preschool animated series called Charlie's Colorform City. The episode is called Charlie and Little Bo Peep, and that's been out for a couple of years on Netflix. But if you're interested in watching it, it's one of the classic Tales with a Twist episodes, which are all parodies of nursery rhymes and fairy tales. And so I did the Little Bo Peep one, Charlie and Little Bo Peep, and there's a sheep called Barry in that episode. He's actually called Barry,
Uh-huh.
Barry, and he is named after Barry Liebman, who was a friend of mine. He was like me, he was a writer for Mad Magazine. Like me, he wrote for some of DC's DC Comics' kids titles. Like we both wrote Looney Tunes comics. And he wrote for, I think he wrote the Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego comic for DC in like
Oh,
the
okay.
90s.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I think he wrote some Batman Adventures comics based on the animated series as well. But he died a few years ago, and I miss him a lot. And I thought it might be a good tribute to him to name a character after him in that episode. So
Yeah.
I was going to look. I mean, you're encouraged to put as many sheep puns in a script like that as possible. So there was probably going to be a character named Barry or Barbara or something like that.
Hmm.
But I thought, well, while I'm at it, why don't I do it as a tribute to my friend? And
Love
so,
that.
thanks.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you are a busy person. You've written widely, and you've probably written a couple of things just this past week that I don't even know about yet. So
Yes, I can honestly say that that is absolutely true.
I thought so. Um, so Ari, I appreciate the time and glad to have you back anytime. Did we miss anything in the talk through that you want to make sure to share before we close?
Not really. Well, I was hoping I would have a chance to get to this
Yes,
at some point.
this is the chance.
But I was talking about I've had the good fortune to have a lot of mentors and just people that vouched for me and that put in a good word for me and helped me out a lot during my career. Um, and Stan Goldberg was one of them, and he's no longer with us. But I wrote a handful of stories for Archie in the late 2000s, like around 2008, 2009. At the beginning of 2010, I got this in the mail. I had just written a story for Archie that had come out it was like a couple of years prior. I did not ask Stan to do this. I
Hmm.
didn't tell him to do this. I wasn't in any position to tell him to do anything like this, but I certainly didn't even ask. But I just got this in the mail, and it's the artwork, the original artwork for the
Wow.
cover of a story we worked on together.
Very
And
nice.
it's hard to see, but it says for Arie Kaplan, wishing you only the best life has to offer, Stan Goldberg, January 2010. Um, and it was amazing. And it's just that's the kind of community that I think you find a lot in the comics industry. And um, it's why that industry is even still around,
Hmm. Hmm.
in the first place. Aside from the fact that the film and TV industry and video game industry keeps using the IPs as keeps adapting the IPs. Um, but it just meant a lot to me. I don't know how he knew that I would love to. I mean, obviously, who wouldn't want to get a piece of original art from Stan Goldberg? But it's when you're starting out in this industry, you're kind of going it alone. You don't know anyone.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think Stan just knew that I looked up to him, and that I would appreciate that. And so things like that will occasionally happen to me in this industry, and I'm incredibly grateful. You know, I'm very lucky, and I'm very grateful to the people who helped me out all these years. So
Well said. Well said. Well, grateful for the time, and I'm sure that there are people along the way that will say the same of you in years to come as well.
I try to pay it forward. I try to help other people. I recommend my friends for writing jobs whenever I can, and illustration jobs, and because I've worked with some amazing illustrators
Mm.
in some of these books. I wrote this book called The Great Food Truck Caper, which is another Spidey and His Amazing Friends book. And it's not only a book, it's a car, folks. It's a car.
It's a
Anyway,
two in
and
one.
it's illustrated by Shane Clester, who also illustrated one of the Little Golden books that I wrote, which was an Avengers Little Golden book called The Thread of Thanos. Um, and I love getting to work with people more than once is always a lot of fun because it's
Mm.
like
Mhm.
you get to know them as people, you become friends with them, you know, and you get to like play to each other's strengths. So that's always cool.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, glad to have you back anytime to talk about projects that are on the way and projects as they come to be. And may the creating continue. And it certainly seems to be going full steam.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jason. It was an absolute pleasure to be here. It was so great talking to you.
Great talking to you as well. Thank you.